Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
In a momentous decision, the Supreme Court has ruled that the government acted unlawfully when it suspended Parliament. In a strongly worded and unanimous verdict, the 11 most senior judges in the UK concluded that the decision to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks was unlawful. The President of the Supreme Court, Lady Hale, said it had the effect of frustrating or preventing Parliament from carrying out its constitutional functions, and that because it happened in the run-up to the Brexit deadline on October the 31st, it had an extreme effect on our democracy. The Prime Minister says, while he disagrees with the ruling, he will abide by it. But opposition leaders are calling on him to resign. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, has this report on the Supreme Court's dramatic ruling and what it could mean for Brexit.
The storm burst, well and truly. Campaigners and lawyers gathering at the highest court in the land.
He thinks we've won. I really hope so.
Ready to pass judgment on the Prime Minister. When it came, the ruling was polite, but devastating too.
Miller and Prime Minister
Boris Johnson broke the law.
The decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification.
Jubilation outside in the rain.
Restores some kind of hope, doesn't it?
Who needs hard booze, right, when you've got a judgment like that?
Those outraged the Prime Minister had advised the Queen to suspend or prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks.
Do this now!
Suspicious, he'd done it to close down debate on Brexit, which he denied.
The effect on the fundamentals of our democracy was extreme. No justification for taking action with such an extreme effect has been put before the court.
The conclusion? It was illegal, so it never happened at all.
The Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty was unlawful, void and of no effect. Parliament has not been prorogued.
The government's lawyers a few weeks ago did not expect this. The court's traditionally allergic to politics and stay well away. But the other side's legal dream came true.
The ruling today speaks volumes. This Prime Minister must open the doors of Parliament tomorrow. MPs must get back and be brave and bold in holding this unscrupulous government to account. Thank you.
So what next? Immediate calls to New York, 3,000 miles away, for the Prime Minister's audacious move condemned by the court.
Prime Minister, are you going to resign?
To be a reason to resign.
Prime Minister. Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you.
For some of his allies, though, it's no emergency.
There's been a court case in our country this morning, which I think one or two of you may have picked up on the...
Another chance to suggest the establishment is trying to stop him.
I have the highest respect, of course, for our judiciary and for the independence of our courts, but I must say I strongly disagree with this judgment. And we in the UK will not be deterred from getting on and delivering on the will of the people to come out of the EU on October the 31st.
Boris Johnson, have you embarrassed the Queen?
But one Number 10 source told me the Supreme Court has made a serious mistake extending its reach into political matters.
To the Queen. When are you going to go face the Prime Minister?
Attacking the judiciary when Downing Street and him are under attack themselves. Back across the Atlantic, every politician's trying to peer into the future. The opposition sniff opportunity.
The Supreme Court has just announced its decision.
The Labour leaders' conference in Brighton disrupted and delighted by the news.
And it shows that the Prime Minister has acted wrongly in shutting down Parliament. It demonstrates a contempt for democracy and an abuse of power by him. And I invite Boris Johnson, in the historic words, to consider his position.
Johnson out! Johnson out!
Johnson out, they chanted. One member of the government told the BBC the Prime Minister should quit, but that's far from widespread in Tory circles at this stage. Instead, MPs replacing the tourists in the House of Commons, taking their seats on the green benches themselves.
There are still quite a few tourists in the chamber. I'm just talking to colleagues and trying to find out what exactly we're going to be doing, but we need to go back to holding the government to account.
I'm just in a taxi going back to Parliament. Parliament should never have been suspended. It was not suspended, and therefore we should be back in there doing our jobs, holding him to account.
The official invitation on this crazy day was issued with customary formality.
Please come to this red one.
Last minute pomp in the rain.
I have instructed the House authorities to prepare not for the recall, the prorogation was unlawful and is void, to prepare for the resumption of the business of the House of Commons. The House of Commons sits tomorrow and that it does so at 11:30 a.m.
But once MPs have raced back here tomorrow, what will they actually do? The alliance of former Tories, still rebels, might try to take control again after the government's approach went so wrong.
That advice was clearly very poor, and I think some of his advisers are going to have to leave.
And they're still coordinating with the opposition parties.
He does not want to be held to account. He does not want to have to answer questions about his disastrous Brexit policy. And in doing so, he was prepared to mislead the Queen and indeed to mislead the whole country.
If Boris Johnson won't do the decent and honourable thing, then I think Parliament has a duty to come together to force him out of office through a vote of confidence.
There's no sign of Labour doing that quite yet. And look who is in Boris Johnson's corner.
I'll tell you, I know him well. He's not going anywhere. Don't worry about him.
A place in power he might have dreamt of for years. But after only 2 months, it's proving harder than perhaps he thought it looked.
Well, let's talk to Laura now from inside the Houses of Parliament. So, Laura, well, you called it a crazy day. I mean, where does this leave Boris Johnson, the government, and what about Brexit?
Well, Fiona, there's certainly never anything like the kind of surprises on this whole political process at the moment. Things just seem to be getting more dramatic and more serious. And the court today stopped short of accusing Boris Johnson personally of misleading the Queen, basically calling him a liar. But other than that, this judgment was just about as bad for the government as they could have dreamt of their worst nightmare. And by any normal comparison, this is a terrible defeat for the Prime Minister, a really bruising event that could do great damage to his reputation. And certainly lots of MPs in his own party are extremely worried about the message that this sends. But remember, we're not living in normal political times, and people inside Boris Johnson's bunker believe that actually this judgment could in time help them make the case that they are trying to put to the country at large, which is that Boris Johnson, they claim, is the only person who's absolutely determined to get Brexit done, whatever the cost. That's what he said that got him into number 10, elected by the Tory membership, and that is how he will be true to the promise that he made. And anyone standing in their way, whether it's opposition MPs, everyone in this building, or the judges just up the road in the Supreme Court, they only add to that impression of him trying to battle these obstacles to try to keep his promise. But to say that is a gamble, that strategy, is a serious understatement. It is ruthless, perhaps, risky, certainly, but don't rule out more audacious moves. But MPs will be back here tomorrow morning. No doubt they'll be asking more questions and trying to put him under more pressure over his Brexit strategy. And just as Boris Johnson's team is determined to carry on like this, there are plenty of people who will be back here in Parliament determined to make life as hard for him as they possibly can.
Laura Kuensberger, Westminster, thank you. Well, the decision by the Supreme Court is not only something of a bombshell for the government, it's also more strongly worded than many expected. So what does it mean for the relationship between the courts and the government, and what impact could it have in the future? Our Home Editor, Mark Easton, reports.
What you're watching never happened. It may look as though in the small hours of September the 10th, the Royal Commissioners attended the House of Lords to suspend or prorogue Parliament, but today the most senior judges in the land said the ceremony was void and had no effect.
To prorogue this present Parliament.
when the Royal Commissioners walked into the House of Lords, it was as if they had walked in with a blank sheet of paper. Parliament has not been prorogued. This is the unanimous judgment of all 11 justices.
This was a constitutional thwack on the nose of government, delivered by the judiciary on behalf of the UK Parliament. The justices made it clear this judgment was a one-off, but its implications will echo down British history. Around Parliament Square in Westminster, there are hidden power lines, a triangle of authority that joins the Houses of Parliament, the government focused on 10 Downing Street, and the judiciary in the Supreme Court. Today, the justices explained that a fundamental principle of British democracy is that the Prime Minister is accountable to Parliament. They also stated that the courts had supervised the lawfulness of government for centuries. Established in 2009 to replace the Law Lords as the UK's most senior judicial body, today saw the Supreme Court beginning to flex its constitutional muscles.
This is probably the biggest day in the history of the Supreme Court so far. With this unanimous judgment, the judges have really set down a marker about their role as a constitutional court, as a check on government and as a defender of parliamentary sovereignty. And although this will have some repercussions for Brexit, it's really much bigger than that. This is about how our parliamentary democracy works.
The Supreme Court is crossing the line, meddling in politics, Downing Street has suggested, but the justices were adamant they had a responsibility to question the motives of the Prime Minister, pointing out he'd failed to submit a witness statement to explain under oath his reasons for suspending Parliament. The only evidence the Supreme Court says it's had was this memo sent by Nicky de Costa, Boris Johnson's legal adviser, recommending suspension. Boris Johnson ticked yes.
This was not a normal prorogation in the run-up to a Queen's speech.
This is a completely proper constitutional procedure.
When Jacob Rees-Mogg, as leader of the House of Commons, went to Balmoral to advise the Queen to suspend Parliament, advice she was bound to accept, the process was unlawful, the justices said. And in a direct criticism of Boris Johnson, the judgment suggested he ignored constitutional responsibilities in favour of party political self-interest. Nowhere is there a hint that the Prime Minister, in giving advice to Her Majesty, is more than simply the leader of the government, seeking to promote its own policies, the justices said.
It is not clear to us that any step is needed from the Prime Minister, but if it is, the Court is pleased that his counsel have told the Court that he will take all necessary steps to comply with the terms of any declaration made by this Court.
Tomorrow morning, Parliament will sit once more, its sovereign place in our democracy restored and enhanced. But it won't be a fresh dawn. Today's judgment means it opens its doors as though the Prime Minister had never closed them. Mark Easton, BBC News, Parliament Square.
So, what happens next? Well, we do know that Parliament will now resume tomorrow. The Queen is then due to set out the government's future plans in a Queen's speech on October the 14th. There are just 3 weeks before the Prime Minister is due to go to Brussels for a summit on October the 17th. In that time, he hopes he'll be able to negotiate a new Brexit deal with the EU. The Prime Minister is still insisting we'll then leave the EU 2 weeks later on October the 31st, come what may. But at the moment, if he doesn't get a Brexit deal approved by Parliament, by law, the government has to ask the EU for another Brexit extension. But a lot could change between now and then. None of this, I must emphasise, is certain. Now, in a moment, we'll speak to our Scotland correspondent, Lorna Gordon, who's at the Queen's Balmoral residence. But first, let's speak to our legal correspondent, Clive Coleman, who's in Westminster for us. And Clive, this unanimous decision was a lot more strongly worded than many expected.
Absolutely, Fiona. Let's just take a moment to pause and think of the enormity of what's happened here. A Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has been found unanimously by the highest court in the land to have unlawfully advised the monarch of the realm to suspend the sovereign body in our constitution, that being Parliament, with the effect that parliamentary business cannot take place. Now, that points up the latest example of something called judicial review. It's a process whereby any of us can go in front of a court and ask independent judges to review the decision of a public authority, could be a minister, could be the Prime Minister, and rule on whether or not that is lawful. And that points up arguably one of the great constitutional clashes of our times between a powerful government and executive on the one hand, used to getting its way, and on the other, independent judges who, through the mechanism of judicial review, can halt the juggernaut of government in its tracks if what ministers have done is unlawful. Judges making political decisions, some will think so, but a firm reminder that nobody is above the rule of law.
Clive, thank you. And Lorna at Balmoral. Well, the Queen has been rather pulled into this legal drama since the court ruled the advice given to the Queen was unlawful.
Yeah, Fiona, there's been no comment, no official reaction from the palace today on that Supreme Court ruling. Remember, it's just under a month since those 3 Privy Councillors headed up by Jacob Rees-Mogg headed up to her summer residence here at Balmoral to advise her to prorogue Parliament. And while the Queen has no leeway in prorogation, she has to follow the advice of her ministers, her Prime Minister. The whole system of a constitutional monarchy is predicated on politicians not doing things that expose the Queen to criticism or even question. And while the Supreme Court ruling didn't go as far as the Court of Session ruling, which said the Prime Minister had an improper purpose when he advised the Queen to prorogue Parliament, they stopped short in effect of saying that Boris Johnson misled the Queen. These will be uncomfortable days for that relationship between the government and the monarchy. We've looked hard. We can find no precedent for an order in council being declared unlawful, void and no effect. And it seems really very unlikely that the Queen would ever expect the order in council, that's the mechanism which suspended Parliament, to be shut down.
Lorna at Balmoral, thank you. So away from the drama in Westminster, what do you make of what's happened? In Stoke-on-Trent, almost 70% of voters opted to leave in the referendum. From there, our political correspondent Alex Forsyth reports.
BBC Radio Stoke.
Wherever the phone in, it seems there's a prevalent view. Leave or remain, people are simply fed up with how Brexit's been handled.
I just don't know anymore. I've just lost the will to live. I can't be bothered with a lot of it anymore.
Local electrician Gary is a regular radio caller who doesn't think today's ruling will change many minds.
I don't think the Joe public it will make one iota of difference. The same people who are backing Boris were backing, now. I just think he should get on with it like most people.
In Stoke, such frustration is rife. More people here voted to leave than any other city in the UK. And there's as much anger at the slow wrangling in Westminster as there is at Boris Johnson's actions.
So at least Boris Johnson's trying to get something done.
I think it's disgusting what they're doing to him. I think he's a good Prime Minister.
They should just back him and let him get on with it.
Even though the court said it's unlawful, he's effectively gone against the law.
What he's done, they've said is unlawful, but I think the guy has got the country at heart. He's trying to get us a deal and get us out of what we voted for.
That's exactly the view Number 10 is counting on. Their strategy is to win support in areas that voted leave, like here in the Midlands and the North, places the Tories will target if there's an election, and where they hope Boris Johnson's do-or-die Brexit attitude, even the fact he's pitting himself against Parliament, will play well with voters. But that doesn't work everywhere. In Altrincham, most people voted to remain, and the Prime Minister's approach hasn't gone down well with some.
I'm a Conservative lifelong and haven't trusted the man forever. So what we're getting is exactly what we deserved.
We don't have a law in this country for nothing. If he's done wrong, he should be punished for it.
I think he definitely should reconsider his position and maybe change his tactics a little bit.
Back in Stoke, these students attend Staffordshire Uni from across the country. All welcome today's court ruling, but no Parliament returning won't provide simple answers.
The Parliament is split just like the country. It's split down the middle. We're in this situation. We need to come up with a solid solution that everyone is going to agree on.
You need everyone across the board to work together. And I know that's hard at the moment with everybody, kind of at each other's necks. But again, what Brexit is doing is it's tearing communities apart.
Split views on the government's actions don't, of course, depend on location. But frustration at this whole Brexit process seems to be cross-country. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Stoke-on-Trent.
Let's speak to our Europe editor, Katya Adler, who's in Brussels for us this evening. So, Katia, what do they make there of what's been happening here today, and what impact could it have on Brexit negotiations?
Well, look, Fiona, the ruling today, of course, raises all sorts of questions for the EU. Will Boris Johnson, their Brexit negotiating partner, stay in his job? When might there be a general election? But what I've been seeing here mainly today, Fiona, is the EU trying to put its hands over its ears and block out all the noise. And why is that? Well, because it sees today's ruling and what happens next in the UK as a domestic political matter. That's why the European Commission didn't want to comment on it today. The EU prefers to concentrate on where it does have a role to play, and that is in negotiations. And there, today's ruling doesn't really change very much. Under EU law, the EU's negotiating partner is Her Majesty's government. Boris Johnson is still the head of that. EU leaders still want a Brexit deal. They would love it. Signed, sealed and delivered by the middle of next month, as Boris Johnson wants it as well. But they remain highly sceptical, as we heard again today from the EU's chief Brexit negotiator. Simply put, the two sides are still very far apart in talks. And Fiona, today's ruling by the Supreme Court did nothing, of course, to change that.
Katia in Brussels, thank you.
It took 14 minutes and 50 seconds for Lady Hale to deliver a stunning defeat to Boris Johnson as Brexit delivered another unexpected shock to the UK's political system. In exactly 2 short months as Prime Minister, he has lost 6 votes here in the House of Commons. Now all 11 Supreme Court judges have ruled as one in deeming his prorogation of Parliament unlawful. Just over an hour later, the Speaker, John Bercow, stepped in front of the assembled cameras to announce the Commons will sit from tomorrow. Opposition party leaders called for the Prime Minister to resign. He said he would fight on to deliver Brexit. As Kieran Jenkins now reports, he has to deal with his own government in crisis first.
For UK democracy, a defining day. For the Prime Minister, devastating. Boris Johnson's reasons for suspending Parliament, the reasons he gave the Queen, torn to shreds by the country's 11 most senior judges, unanimously.
The court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification.
We were witnessing, said the Supreme Court President, a one-off, history forged as the Prime Minister's 5-week suspension of Parliament was overturned.
The Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty was unlawful, void and of no effect. This means that the order in Council to which it led was also unlawful, void and of no effect and should be quashed. This means that when the Royal Commissioners walked into the House of Lords, it was as if they had walked in with a blank sheet of paper. The prorogation was also void and of no effect. Parliament has not been prorogued. This is the unanimous judgment of all 11 justices.
The consequences, enormous and immediate. Boris Johnson's political opponents, through the courts, will have him hauled back before Parliament.
This is an absolutely momentous decision. The Supreme Court has unanimously ruled that Parliament has not been prorogued. So there is nothing to stop us, members of Parliament such as myself and my colleagues, from resuming immediately the important job of scrutinising this minority Tory government as we hurtle towards Brexit.
Well, this could not have been a more damning rebuke of the Prime Minister from the highest court in the land, ruling unanimously that not only was the advice that he gave the Queen when he asked her to suspend Parliament unlawful, but the effect of that on the very foundations of our democracy was extreme. And so Parliament is soon to be unlocked.
I am ready for work. I shall be in my chair tomorrow and I look forward to Parliament sitting and we will go about our business. That's our responsibility and I'll do my bit. It's only a part of the story. A lot of other people will, I'm sure, do their bit.
Do you expect the
and
Prime
that's
Minister
what the public would expect.
Do you expect the Prime Minister to be sitting there as well?
I've no idea who will and won't be there, but I will be there.
Prime Minister, are you going to resign? He is staying as Prime Minister, but rushing back ahead of schedule tonight from the UN General Assembly. where his response at a New York business reception at first drew laughter.
There's been a court case in our country this morning, which I think one or two of you may have picked up on the media, and it would be
11 Supreme Court justices think otherwise, but Boris Johnson still insists his motive in suspending Parliament was for a Queen's speech and a new domestic agenda. But listen, is this an admission it was Brexit related after all?
I strongly disagree with this judgment, and we in the UK will not be deterred from getting on and delivering on the will of the people to come out of the EU on October the 31st.
Overall, the script is unchanged. Boris Johnson wants an election. Labour, conferencing amid the chaos, appear to want to keep the Prime Minister in post until a no-deal Brexit is avoided, squirming with his -45 non-majority.
The Supreme Court has just announced its decision. And it shows that the Prime Minister has acted wrongly in shutting down Parliament. And I invite Boris Johnson, in the historic words, to consider his position and become I got that message, and become the shortest serving Prime Minister there's ever been.
Quit, says Jeremy Corbyn. But his position too is in unprecedented territory for an opposition leader, resisting for now the temptation to go to the polls and force the Prime Minister out. A Prime Minister under fire.
He was prepared to mislead the Queen and indeed to mislead the whole country. He is not fit for office. He should resign.
From the First Ministers of Wales.
When a Prime Minister is found to have acted unlawfully and undemocratically, I don't see how that person thinks that he can legitimately continue in office.
And Scotland.
In my view, this UK government should be removed from office as soon as possible. There is, in truth, no functioning UK government right now. And as of today, we know beyond doubt that to the extent that it is functioning at all, it is a government prepared to ride roughshod over democracy and the law.
His former cabinet colleagues. Should he apologise to the Queen?
I think he should apologise to Parliament.
But what of the Brexit Party, still hopeful of an election pact ruled out by the Conservatives? Do you trust Boris Johnson in light of this ruling?
In a sense,
it should be an easy question to answer. He's the Prime Minister.
Yeah,
you want to go into an electoral pact with him. Do you trust that man?
Well, what we want to know is how can we leave with a clean break Brexit? Because actually, that's what Brexiteers want. We don't trust Boris at the moment because he's clearly trying to aim for a rehash, a reheating of Theresa May's worst deal in history, this dreadful, dreadful withdrawal agreement.
The final, monumental word, though, is the Supreme Court's. Its ruling on these two legal challenges begin to set the UK Constitution in stone.
Today's ruling confirms that we are a nation governed by the rule of law. Laws that everyone, even the Prime Minister, is not above.
And so Boris Johnson is forced back tomorrow to Westminster and a deluge of scrutiny. The courts are firm that Parliament, like the weather, cannot be turned on and off. The Prime Minister, right now, has control of neither.
Kieran Jenkins reporting. Well, now, our political editor, Gary Gibbon, joins us now from New York, where Boris Johnson has been attending the United Nations General Assembly. Gary, what has been the response from the government team accompanying him over there in New York?
Well, in the official statements, you get an awful lot of them saying there is respect for the Supreme Court. In the anonymous briefings that are coming out of Number 10, you get a bit less respect, a bit of talk, an implication that the Supreme Court has overreached, that it's sort of on manoeuvres a bit. You sense the cadences of Dominic Cummings in some of this language, the Prime Minister's chief aide and the man behind much of the hardline strategy. And so you sense that that strategy is, for all the problems that it's encountering, still the main strategy that is being pursued. About 3 hours ago, Boris Johnson met up with President Trump, and as so often, President Trump was trying to lend Boris Johnson a hand, and as so often, it wasn't entirely clear whether he was being helpful. Here's a little clip from that exchange.
And he's doing a fantastic job, not easy, but doing a really good job. But I think he's going to make great progress come October, come November. But great progress for the country along
October the 31st.
The results are going to start to show in November. But it looks to me like he is making great progress. So it's an honor to have you here. We're going to be discussing trade. We can quadruple our trade with UK.
Well, about an hour ago, a conference call with Cabinet started. We don't know whether it's still going on or has tailed off, but I was messaged by some people who were going to take part in that conference call who were saying they were going to try and push back on the brittle language that's been used about the Supreme Court. But will they be successful in that, and do they have an alternative strategy? It's not at all clear that they do. I think what we can expect in the near future is the stuff we were getting today off Boris Johnson, an awful lot of rhetoric about how the only thing that can unglue this situation is an early election, but that doesn't look like it's going to happen. And we have a situation where Boris Johnson is going to be perhaps even more than he has been already, a kind of sort of zombie prime minister with MPs trying to spoon feed him, force feed him with policies he doesn't want to implement. The other way out for him, of course, is to suddenly make a success of the deal, the negotiations with the European Union, but they've been watching him like a hawk to see if any deal would actually get through Parliament, and they've been very sceptical about that. And you have to say that the last 24 hours must have made them think that Boris Johnson couldn't walk a small parcel through the House of Commons, let alone force through a withdrawal agreement.
After all this, though, Gary, is there anything we can be certain about?
Well, the Prime Minister is saying he's not going to resign immediately, so there's one thing to tick on your list. Jeremy Corbyn is signalling he's not going to force a vote of no confidence immediately in the Prime Minister, so you can tick that off, and that's because Jeremy Corbyn is worried that an early election, an election before the 31st of October, before we've actually decided that we've got an extension to EU membership, a delay to Brexit, until that's nailed down, he thinks that that is a trap. So that's about as much as you can be sure of, and it's pretty near-term stuff.
Gary, thank you. We need you back here in Westminster. Well, now, earlier I asked the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, if the Supreme Court judgment was enough to stop the Prime Minister delivering a no-deal Brexit, considering the Labour Party has been unable to do that so far.
It's true, but we'll use all the democratic institutions that are available to us, the courts and, yes, Parliament, to hold him to account. I believe, actually, the Conservative Party itself now needs to consider about whether the wisdom of electing Boris Johnson as leader of their party, because we've never had any other Prime Minister of any political hue override the democracy of Parliament and be condemned by the judges in this way, wholeheartedly condemned by the judges.
Well, now with me now is the Scottish National Party's Joanna Cherry QC, who is the lead claimant in the proceedings brought against the government in Scotland, which of course went your way and went the same way as the justices went. I'll come to that in a moment, but did you expect the justices to go as far as they have?
Well, I was cautiously optimistic that they were going to follow the Scottish court judgment, having sat through the arguments in court last week. But I didn't think the decision would be unanimous and as trenchantly worded as it is.
What does unanimity indicate?
Well, it indicates that there can be no question about the matter. Not one single one of 11 judges doubted the reasoning that Lady Hale read out this morning. And in Supreme Court judgments, particularly where there's 7+ judges, it's quite common to have a couple at least of dissenters.
I mean, there will be people who know nothing about the Supreme Court and will say, well, look, they're all cut from the same cloth. They'll inevitably agree together.
No, I mean, that's not the case. I mean, the Supreme Court comprises, there's 2 Scottish judges, there's a judge from Northern Ireland. They will have a variety of different backgrounds. Lady Hale, the President, came up through an academic background, a background in family law. Other judges will have come through the commercial background. Other judges would have worked in personal injury law. So there's a variety of different backgrounds and a variety of different approaches.
What are the consequences of this judgment?
Well, I think it's certainly the most momentous constitutional judgment in the United Kingdom in my lifetime. I think the great thing about it is that it restores parliamentary democracy, and it means that the Prime Minister of a minority government can no longer hide from the scrutiny of the democratically elected members of this Parliament.
But there will be people worrying out there, particularly people who are perhaps pro-Brexit, who will fear that what this judgment does is either to delay or destroy Brexit.
Well, Lady Hale herself said at the outset of delivering her opinion this morning that it was crucial to understand that the court wasn't looking at the question of when and in what circumstances the United Kingdom will leave the European Union. The court was purely looking at whether or not this prorogation was lawful. But the advantage of having Parliament up and running again is that Parliament can prevent Boris Johnson from sneaking a no-deal Brexit through the back door. And of course, regardless of whether you're pro-Brexit or against Brexit, all the evidence shows that a no-deal Brexit would be extremely damaging to the British economy.
Who should resign? Boris
Johnson should go, and Jacob Rees-Mogg should look at his position as well.
What about the Attorney-General? It was his advice.
Well, the Attorney-General gave advice that has been leaked rather mysteriously this afternoon. One does wonder about the motivations of those leaking it. But be in no doubt about it, this was a plot that was hatched in Number 10 by Nicky DaCosta and Dominic Cumming and Boris Johnson, who thought they were oh so clever and have turned out not to be as clever as they thought they were.
A one-word answer. Should Boris Johnson apologise to the Queen?
Yes.
Joanna Cherry, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, now, earlier I spoke to the leading pro-Brexit MP, Steve Baker, and I started by asking him what he made of the Supreme Court decision.
Well, it's a surprising judgment that they were unanimous, but I have to say, although the constitutionally Supreme Court has ruled this way, it's an odd position that they disagree with some of the most senior judges in the land, including the Lord Chief Justice, the Master of the Rolls, and the President of the Queen's Bench of the High Court. So this is an odd position, but what I'm concerned about is the deepening of the constitutional crisis that it causes.
So what do you do about all that?
Well, the fundamental problem is that Boris Johnson inherited a minority government and then has had to withdraw the whip from 21 Conservatives. So we really need a general election. That is the usual procedure when the government loses its majority in the House of Commons. And because of the Fixed Term Parliament Act, he needs a two-thirds majority. So I'm afraid the problem we've got is that the opposition and rebel Conservatives are holding him hostage in Number 10 without a majority. So I'm afraid what we need is an early general election and to sort this mess out.
Well, in thinking about what the justices have ruled, and they were 11 of them, and they were unanimous, it seems you think the justices have gone rogue.
No, that's your words, and I would not put it in that way. I got into politics to uphold parliamentary democracy and the rule of law, and it's very important to me that we uphold the independence of the judiciary and respect their rulings. That doesn't mean we don't have to we can't disagree with them, but we do need to respect their rulings. So I'm not going to accuse them of going rogue.
But you talk also about the rule of law and respecting the rule of law. We have these 11 justices who've made this ruling, and yet your Attorney General's advice, which has been leaked, but has been verified as his advice, has indeed given precisely the information that they acted upon, which is that it was perfectly legal to prorogue Parliament in the way it was. It wasn't, and they must surely suffer for that.
Well, no. The Attorney General gives his opinion as a lawyer, and he's the government's lawyer, and it's quite right that the Prime Minister should comply with the law, and he will have taken the Attorney General's advice. I haven't had the opportunity to read it, but we must uphold the principle that we have the rule of law, not the rule of judges, but the rule of law. Parliament is supreme in making that law, and then we rely on the judges to interpret it, so there can be no question of some kind of retribution.
And who is now going to apologise to the Queen?
That's a matter for the Prime Minister to determine whether an apology is necessary and to give it if he thinks that it is. But look, we are in uncharted waters. The Supreme Court judgment itself says that this is something which hasn't arisen before and should not arise again. And so, you know, these really are exceptional circumstances, and I think we need to be not precipitate in how we deal with them.
Many people suspect that the Downing Street machine have had a very big hand in this, but particularly Dominic Cummings. Should he resign?
I've been through this before with Dominic Cummings. During vote leave, when things got difficult, people called for him to go. And I was amongst those who defended him at the time, and we went on to win. So I'm not going to leap in and say he should go. Clearly there have been elements of the strategy which have not worked. We didn't get to a general election in particular.
Steve Baker, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
You're welcome, John.
Steve Baker talking to us from his constituency. Now over to Matt in the studio.
Thanks, John. Well, earlier I spoke to Amber Rudd, who resigned from Boris Johnson's cabinet shortly after he announced his now unlawful prorogation, although that wasn't her stated reason for stepping down. I began by asking her what evidence she was shown at the time about the legality of suspending Parliament.
The first I heard about Parliament potentially being prorogued was when I got a text at about 8:15 a.m. that morning from David Gauke saying, "Have you heard Parliament's about to be prorogued?" And then we were told that Cabinet was being convened on a telephone call for 10:45, and then we were told that morning that Parliament would be prorogued.
So there was no discussion of prorogation inside Cabinet?
No, there was no discussion except at that call on the day that it was announced that the Parliament would be prorogued the following week, either on the Monday or the Thursday.
So why did you not at that stage put up your hand and protest?
One of my colleagues asked for the legal advice on prorogation. I had it in my mind I was going to ask that question, but he asked it and the Prime Minister confirmed that we would get that legal advice. That for me was going to be good enough.
But did you get that advice?
I never got it. I asked for it several times.
So you actually took the Prime Minister by his word at the time when he said, you know, these are the reasons why we're doing it?
Yes, I did.
Do you regret that now?
I had doubts about it, which is why I persisted and asked for the legal advice, which I never got.
Do you actually regret having served in Boris Johnson's cabinet? Because by doing so, by signing up to a no-deal Brexit, you basically trampled on all the principles that you once held dear.
No, I think it was the right thing to do. I entered into cabinet in good faith. I wanted to help make it work. But I found during my period there that there was so much emphasis on no-deal preparations, there was an absence of deal preparations.
But unlike most people, you also famously once said, Boris Johnson is the life and soul of the party, but I wouldn't trust him to drive me home. Why did you suddenly trust him to drive the country?
I don't think that metaphor holds when someone becomes Prime Minister. I was willing to work with him. I wanted him to succeed. I still want him to succeed.
After all this?
Of course I want him to succeed. I want there to be a deal. But my point is, he cannot do that against Parliament or against the law.
So someone has clearly made a major miscalculation here. Who should resign? Should it be the Attorney General? Should it be Jacob Rees-Mogg? Should it be the Prime Minister?
That will be for the Prime Minister to have to decide.
Should Dominic Cummings resign?
I will let him, obviously. I'm not going to call for individual people to resign.
I'm astonished that you're not calling for the resignation of Dominic Cummings, since he is the man widely believed to have, concocted the strategy of suspending Parliament.
I do think that the Prime Minister's advisers, and yes, Dominic Cummings is one of them, have got a lot to answer for. I hope that he will change strategy. If he can do that with his existing set of advisers, fantastic. If he can't, then he'll need a new set.
Should Boris Johnson apologise to the Queen?
That's going to be up to the Prime Minister.
So you think that might be something worth doing?
I haven't really thought about the Prime Minister's relationship with the Queen.
But he's dragged her into something which makes her position very uncomfortable. Should he apologise to the Queen?
I don't know the answer to that, Matt. I'm going to let the courtiers and advisers work that one out.
Is there a danger that the Prime Minister will continue to try and pit Parliament against the people and now the courts against the people?
You see, I think that's so wrong.
But do you think he's trying to do that?
It feels like it, yes. And
but that is really serious, isn't it?
I think it is serious, and I have said to him several times in Cabinet and out that this whole language of pitting Parliament against the people is a mistake. It leads to demonstrations which can lead to violence, and I think that we need to step back and try and find compromise. But I would not want a different Prime Minister. I want Boris Johnson, who's been elected by the Conservative Party as Prime Minister, to sort this out.
Despite the fact that he has broken the highest law of the land?
He can now abide by the law. Parliament will be coming back and we can find a new way through.
Amber Rudd speaking to him earlier. Well, joining me now from Brussels is Philip Lamberts, the Belgian MEP who sits on the European Parliament's Brexit steering group. Thanks for coming back on the programme, Philip Lamberts. When you look at events in London today, does that fill you with despair or hope?
Well, both, actually, and I take the events of the last 2 days in sequence. So what happened today is a sign that even though the United Kingdom does not have a written constitution, and maybe should have one, at least we have an independent judiciary who is still able to perform its role of counterbalance to the executive and avoid abuse. And so that is refreshing, I would say, and I read the the decision of the Supreme Court, and indeed that shows that there's still life in the British democracy, so that's a good sign. But the bad sign is what happened yesterday at the Labour conference, where once again, under Jeremy Corbyn, Labour was unable to formulate a credible policy on Brexit. And indeed, you might say that the predicament of Boris Johnson is dire, but on the other hand, he is facing a totally divided opposition, in the sense that you do not have one single strategy, and especially the biggest opposition party, or Majesty's opposition, is unable to formulate a clear policy on well, what is basically the most crucial issue for the future of the country. You see Labour just dithering and unable to say.
All right, Philip Lambert, but the Prime Minister will still say that he's... OK, let me just say, the Prime Minister will still say that he's hopeful and working hard to get a deal out of Brussels, which he can put before Parliament before the end of the month. Do you think that's even realistic?
Well, first of all, I do not know what working hard means in the mind of Boris Johnson, because so far we didn't see a negotiating team on the British side really negotiating. I mean, well, at long last, we had 3 non-papers put on the table last Friday, but they know pretty well what they were doing, that these 3 papers are not providing any solution to the Irish issue, and therefore they are just buying time. So Boris Johnson wants to give the impression that his team is negotiating in Brussels, while at the same time there's no negotiation happening.
Right. Philip Lambert's got to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Let's go back to John in the House of Commons. John.
Well, there was an unusual feeling in Labour conference as the result from the Supreme Court came in this morning. Unity. Bruising battles over the Deputy Leader's position and Brexit policy were forgotten as the party called on Boris Johnson to resign. In a hastily rearranged Leader's speech this evening, Jeremy Corbyn set out his stall for a general election. He said that would come after a no-deal Brexit was prevented. Paul McNamara is in Brighton.
Hello, how are you doing? Nice to see you all. The schedule's been torn up. He walked in to make this leader's speech a day earlier than planned and with a different script. This conference had been overshadowed by Brexit, but this afternoon when Jeremy Corbyn took to the stage, his party that had been divided on policy was united in opposition against a Prime Minister who suffered an unprecedented defeat in the Supreme Court.
The Prime Minister acted illegally when he tried to shut down opposition to his reckless and disastrous plan to crash out of the European Union without a deal. But he has failed.
Mr Corbyn said when Parliament returns tomorrow, Boris Johnson would be held to account.
This unelected Prime Minister should now resign.
That one went down well with the crowd. Johnson out, they chant. But despite saying the Prime Minister has to go right now, Mr Corbyn explained he would not force an election immediately.
That election needs to take place as soon as this government's threat of a disastrous no deal is taken off the table.
And with an eye on that election, and with a Brexit policy freshly agreed yesterday at conference, Mr Corbyn made his pitch as a national unifier.
Only a vote for Labour will deliver a public vote on Brexit. Only a Labour government will put the power back in the hands of the people. We can bring our country and our people together, which is what I'm trying to do all the time.
Deep in the heart of the speech, a new policy announcement too. His commitment to be seen as the party of the NHS, a radical shake-up of the pharmaceutical industry.
We will create a new, publicly owned, generic drugs manufacturer to supply cheaper medicines to our NHS. Saving our health service money and saving lives at the same time.
The rich thread that weaved through this speech, though, wasn't policy, but attack line after attack line on the Prime Minister.
When Boris Johnson compared Muslim women to letterboxes or bank robbers. It wasn't a flippant comment, it was calculated to play on people's fears.
And the punchline for this speech, a call to arms for the election he knows not when will come, but is almost certainly on the horizon.
You do go forward to win an election for the people of this country.
There were many attacks on the Prime Minister in that speech. Shouldn't he have just announced calling for a vote of no confidence?
He'll call for a no confidence at the right time, not when Boris or the Tories or the media or the establishment wants, but when it's good for the people.
We've got to look after the nation first, right? It's country first. We've got to make sure that they don't bounce us into a no-deal Brexit. We cannot afford that. So that's
Greatest here, we keep the red flag flying.
Conference, for the leader at least, finished today. It started with division, it's ended with the leader of the opposition heading back to Parliament to face off against a humiliated Prime Minister.
Joining us now from Brighton is Labour's Shadow Attorney General Shami Chakrabarti. Lady Chakrabarti, who resigns as a result of this justice?
Please, just Shami, John, come on. So who should resign as a result?
Yeah, who should resign? Well, me, perhaps, for not calling you Shami, sorry.
I think that, look, John, if I were Boris Johnson, which is a ridiculous thing to say, but to just play in with my magical thinking for a moment, I've just been called out by the highest court in the land. I've been called out 11-0 of having abused my power. I think I would resign.
And
who
you know apologises?
What? People like Boris Johnson.
Who apologises?
Apologies. I don't need apologies. I need his resignation, because instead of apologies or resignations, we've been reading on Twitter while I was waiting to come on, John, and apparently Number 10 are briefing out against the Supreme Court. So they've had a go at Churchill's grandson and Ken Clarke, and now they're briefing against the Supreme Court. This is not what these posh boys are supposed to do. They learnt at their schools that when you lose at cricket, you say, well played, fair play, and yet you lose in the highest court in the land and you start attacking the judges. That is out of order. Now, I know my colleague Keir Starmer has apparently said that Geoffrey Cox needs to consider his position because he called it wrong. Now, look, he's a better paid lawyer than I am. I seem to have called it right, but that's not the reason why Geoffrey Cox should consider his position.
But then if you feel so strongly about this...
his Prime Minister back into control.
If you feel so strongly about this...
John.
Why don't you go for a general election? I mean, why don't you just force his resignation?
No, I understand. I really understand the question, John. It burns in my soul, and here's the problem. We cannot crash out with a no-deal Brexit during the period of the general election campaign. So we need that letter to be sent to the European Union. We need the extension, and then we want the general election, of course.
Do you think that this in any way affects the neutrality that the leader has spelt out that is going to be played in the course of the next, period, particularly when you go into a general election? Surely you will have to have a view on what should happen to this country.
We do have a view. We want jobs and services and the best possible relationship with our nearest neighbours. It's essential. But what we have to do is bring this country, this riven country, back together. Boris Johnson and his posh mates, I'm sorry, John, it's not where they came from, it's where they're going, and it's the far-right playbook that they're playing from. They are dividing and ruling, and we have to somehow find a way to bring this back together.
But that doesn't solve what voters should do if they want to support Labour. Are you Remain or are you Leave?
So John, I'm all, my record is public. I campaigned to Remain in 2016. It was not a great campaign. So mea culpa, as well as all the people that organised that campaign. It was too cerebral, it was too technical, it was too much about, captains of industry and not enough about values.
Shami Chakrabarti,
I lost,
sadly,
but
that's
what
where
I want to do...
We have to leave it, but thank you very much indeed for joining us and for giving us your view. Thank you.
Well, thanks, John. Thank you, John.
Back now to the historic ruling that the advice given to the Queen to suspend Parliament was unlawful. even for a supposedly flexible, largely unwritten constitution, the unprecedented events of this year are a huge stress test to the system. A government losing multiple votes without falling, a minority government hanging on to power whilst the opposition refuses to support an election, and now a prime minister whose actions are ruled unlawful. And the Queen put in a rather difficult position. Now, while it may feel like we are in uncharted waters, this isn't the first constitutional crisis with the monarchy at the centre. The Queen faced in 1963, perhaps until now, her toughest crisis when Prime Minister Harold Macmillan resigned in ill health. It fell to her to choose his successor. In 1909, the People's Budget of Liberal Chancellor David Lloyd George promised higher taxes and land reforms to benefit the poor. It triggered a 3-year war with the House of Lords, who overturned it. And tensions in 1642 led to civil war when King Charles I tried to personally arrest 5 lawmakers. 7 years later, he lost his head after being tried for high treason. So, actual heads may not roll this time, only metaphorical ones. And although this is a historic day for the Constitution, what will actually change? Well, with me now is Barrister Martin Howe, Chairman for pro-Brexit group Lawyers of Britain, and Catherine Haddon, the Institute for Government's resident historian and constitutionalist. Welcome to you both. Catherine, let me start with you.
Yep.
The Attorney General has said that his judgment was in good faith, that he considered it very carefully and said the suspension of Parliament would be lawful and constitutional. Does that make him a bad lawyer?
It's difficult to say. The thing is, the Supreme Court have now ruled on this, but before that, we had had no such thing. So this is the first time that a court has got into this thorny area of both this particular royal prerogative power and also this question about the role of Parliament. So it's the court also saying what has happened in Parliament, saying that Parliament is not prorogued and ruling effectively that this prorogation never happened. And that's new territory. So, you know, it may be that the Attorney General therefore looks back on that and says, in good faith, that was my interpretation, but there is now a ruling and it was unlawful.
I mean, it's amazing to consider that this court that we're all talking about today is only 10 years old. I think it was founded almost exactly 10 years ago, October 2009. And we didn't really know an awful lot about it. Were you surprised by the unanimity of this verdict?
Personally, I was, because there's a big contrast between this ruling and the previous ruling of the English High Court, headed by the Lord Chief Justice, that said there's actually no objective legal standard by which you can judge whether or not...
But it agreed with the Scottish court, didn't it? So
it agreed with the Scottish court. But the English court pointed out, English High Court pointed out there was no legal standard by which you can judge political reasons, and indeed the courts are not apt people to judge political reasons. And what's happened, and I agree with you on this point, the Supreme Court has actually created a rule of law that did not previously exist. And it's written down in paragraph 50 of its judgment.
OK. Sadly, we haven't got time to read paragraph 50 of the judgment. But are you basically saying that this court has become politicised?
I wouldn't use the word politicised. I certainly think it's become activist. And I think the problem...
Activist? And that's quite a loaded term, isn't it?
I think the problem they've now got themselves into is weighing what are good and bad political reasons, because they concluded there was no good reason for this prorogation. Now, there's an obvious and very good reason. Some people may not agree with it, and that is to prevent Parliament mucking up the delicate negotiations between the Prime Minister and the European Union pending the summit.
But doesn't this ruling, doesn't the existence of this court show that in the middle of a constitutional crisis, this is precisely what we need in this country?
I mean, it's important to remember they didn't sort of speak to the issue about the Prime Minister's intent about this. They talked about the effect that it had had. And they were also quite clear that it was that the government had not made the case as to why it is not doing the things they said, which is affecting Parliament's ability to legislate, affecting Parliament's ability to scrutinise. But it was very new that they were saying that Parliament and the supremacy of Parliament is really important, and the executive should not have the power to be able to stymie that. That was very new.
Now, Boris Johnson originally said when he suspended Parliament, it's got nothing to do with Brexit, it's about the Queen's speech, we need to create a bit of time here. Today, he said, actually, this is the people who are opposed to Brexit are trying to thwart the will of the people expressed in the referendum. He has made it very political, this judgment, hasn't he?
Well,
and he's made it about Brexit.
I'm afraid I don't think he's made it political. I think that the whole case was political all along. of course.
But isn't that dangerous for this country?
No,
you know, if you start politicising the courts, rightly or wrongly, who are going to be the neutral arbiters, you know, of our constitution?
Indeed, I think the problem with this case is those who have forced the courts down this road of taking inherently political decisions are those who've brought these challenges. And I'm afraid I think the Supreme Court have been unwise to go down the road of adjudicating on these highly political questions.
Catherine, you know, I spent a lot of time in America where, of course, the Supreme Court, you know, is supreme and it's incredibly political because these are political appointments that have to be approved by Congress. Are we going to see the same thing in this country? An enormous amount of scrutiny and interest in who sits on the Supreme Court?
On the appointment process, I think we're way off that. On this question about whether or not you know, the Supreme Court should get into this. It's not just about that. You've got to also examine who's bringing cases now. We have opened up this whole new area where actually the courts are playing a role in sort of political opposition and so forth, or being asked to by those who are opposed. And I don't think you can sort of draw that back. People want a constitutional authority, and in the absence of Parliament or the government doing it, where else do you turn but the courts?
Just very briefly, Annunziata Rees-Mogg, you know, Brexit Party MEP, sister of, tweeted today that, you know, does anyone know how these judges voted in the referendum? That's unacceptable, isn't it?
Well, I don't think we should get into that. And I don't think that the courts operate on the basis of deciding cases because of the way they voted. I think there are broader issues to do with the underlying ethos of those who are appointed to the judiciary, which perhaps are more relevant. I think it's probably long overdue that we should remember, as you pointed out, the Supreme Court is only about 10 years old. It was created by the Blair government as a result of a ram raid on the previous constitution. And I think we need to look carefully again at the effect of those reforms.
And I'm sure we will. Martin Howard, Catherine Haddon, thank you very much indeed.
There has been plenty of seismic activity here in Parliament the past couple of months on account of Brexit, of course. Well, today came the greatest jolt yet to the government of Boris Johnson. Tonight, MPs are heading back here, ready to resume their arguments over Brexit in the morning, after the Supreme Court unexpectedly and unanimously ruled that the Prime Minister's advice to the Queen to suspend Parliament was unlawful. This evening in Downing Street, we've heard that he'd phoned the Queen, but he didn't say if he'd apologised. In fact, Mr Johnson is out of the country still tonight, over in New York. He said he'd strongly disagreed with the Supreme Court's decision. Yes, he would respect it. No, he wouldn't be resigning. But there have been many calls for him to do just that from opposition parties.
Outside the Supreme Court, a storm was building. And then the storm broke when Lady Hale and her fellow 10 judges made their historic judgment about whether the PM had broken the law when proroguing Parliament and sending MPs and Lords home for 5 weeks.
The decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. This means that the order in Council to which it led was also unlawful, void, and of no effect, and should be quashed. This means that when the Royal Commissioners walked into the House of Lords, it was as if they had walked in with a blank sheet of paper.
And here was Boris Johnson's nightmare made real.
The prorogation was also void and of no effect. Parliament has not been prorogued.
The plaintiffs who brought the case that humiliated the PM included a campaigner who also defeated the last Prime Minister, Theresa May, at the Supreme Court, Gina Miller.
Today's ruling confirms that we are a nation governed by the rule of law. Laws that everyone, even the Prime Minister, is not above.
And an SNP MP, Joanna Cherry.
His advice given to Her Majesty the Queen was unlawful, his position is untenable, and he should have the guts for once to do the decent thing and resign.
In New York, he muttered something about wanting an election, but showed no obvious contrition.
I strongly disagree with what the justices have found. I don't think that it's right, but we will go ahead and, of course, Parliament will come back. I do think there's a good case for getting on with a Queen's speech anyway, and we'll do that. But I think the most important thing is we get on and deliver Brexit on October the 31st.
But Boris Johnson doesn't have the numbers in Parliament to govern, and the Speaker of the House of Commons, John Bercow, said that MPs who are bossing Boris Johnson will be back at work within hours.
I've instructed the House authorities to undertake such steps as are necessary to ensure that the House of Commons sits tomorrow and that it does so at 11:30 a.m.
Today at the seaside in Brighton, the leader of the opposition and Labour members were pretty clear what they wanted.
Boris Johnson has been found to have misled the country. This unelected Prime Minister should now resign. Johnson, he thinks he's above us all. He's part of an elite that disdains democracy. I tell you this, I don't think he's fit to be Prime Minister.
So what's Corbyn's plan?
This can only be settled with a general election. That election needs to take place as soon as this government's threat of a disastrous no deal is taken off the table.
So Corbyn wants an election, but not till he's confident that we're not leaving the EU without a deal on the 31st of October. And Corbyn's in touch with other opposition leaders to reinforce the prison they're building around Johnson.
Boris Johnson is not fit to be Prime Minister. He has acted unlawfully in trying to silence Parliament, trying to silence the voices of the people, because he does not want to be held to account. He does not want to have to answer questions about his disastrous Brexit policy.
We'll be seeking to work with other parties, Labour and other parties. Firstly, as we did a few weeks ago, to prioritise stopping a no-deal Brexit, but then secondly, getting this government out of office. This is a government that is not fit for office.
But he's really not bothered.
We respect the judiciary in our country, we respect the court. I disagree profoundly with what they had to say.
It's just another day in the office.
Yeah, well, it's tomorrow's another day in Parliament, that's what that
Well, not quite another day. The chains come off tomorrow and MPs will be back to work trying to make it impossible for him to do that no-deal Brexit they hate. Robert Peston, News at 10.
So when those chains that Robert mentioned do come off the gates of Parliament and MPs get to work, what are they going to do with the extra time they've now got? Well, we have the order paper for tomorrow. It lists prayers at 11:30, followed by urgent questions, if any. I think it's probably fair to say there might be a few of those as MPs try to plot the way forward for Brexit.
Within minutes of today's judgment, MPs were already snapping themselves, resuming their seats in the Commons. But where exactly do they sit on what happens next?
What does it mean for the Prime Minister, sir?
Those arriving back here do have answers to that question, but yet again, they struggled to speak in unison.
What can Parliament possibly debate that hasn't already been discussed?
Oh, good God, we haven't had the proper account. We haven't had the proper analysis of the Yellowhammer still. We haven't had the debate about how this prorogation happened. We haven't got the details of his deal. We think it's a uniform deal. We need the time to discuss the British people need to know.
They could also make the debate about the Prime Minister's future. The first option for MPs would be to hold a vote of no confidence. But only the smaller parties emerged today cheering that idea.
It is now time that we come together, that we have a vote of no confidence, that we eject this government from Westminster and we go back to the people in a general election. Let the people have their say.
But you know you don't have the numbers for that in Parliament. There won't be enough MPs willing to vote him down in a vote of no confidence.
Well, I'm afraid parliamentarians have got to accept their responsibilities.
If they don't bring down the government, the Prime Minister could end things himself and try again to call an election. But MPs back in their offices are also making it their work to block that route too. Isn't the only way out of this a general election?
Well, the real risk with an election before the extension is granted is that Boris Johnson uses that as a chance to crash us into no deal. And all the parties, including Labour, made clear they weren't going to fall for that trick last time. And, you know, given this is a Prime Minister who repeatedly lies, we're not going to trust him on it again.
So the Prime Minister's stuck, still insisting on his strategy, but perhaps the only route is for him to change it. Some MPs say it's time for one last go at Theresa May's deal.
The quickest, surest way of getting this done is to bring the withdrawal agreement back and to make those 30 people who didn't vote for it last time vote for it this time. There's no shortcuts.
But why would they when it was defeated 3 times before?
Because they've now seen that their alternative plan, the no-deal Brexit, has now been defeated 3 times itself.
Outside Downing Street this evening, flooding made things even more impassable. How does the Prime Minister cross this divide? Paul Brand, News at 10, Westminster.
Well, the Prime Minister should be back here tomorrow in time for the resumption of Parliament. Between now and then, he has the small matter of addressing the United Nations at 1 in the morning, our time. Well, our political correspondent, Carl Dinnan, has been travelling with the Prime Minister and joins us now from New York. First of all, Carl, talk us through this phone call between Boris Johnson and the Queen today.
Well, in the midst of a very busy day here in New York, the Prime Minister had to make 2 big calls. One, as you say, was to the Queen. Now, it's quite unusual for us even to be told that they've spoken, and certainly Number 10 weren't going to divulge any of the contents of the call or whether or not he apologised to her. But given that this morning the Supreme Court ruled that the Prime Minister had asked the Queen to do something which is now known to be unlawful, well, the mind boggles as to what they spoke about. The other big call he had to make was a conference call with his cabinet to discuss what they're going to do next. The one thing they did decide was that next week's Conservative Party conference would go ahead, but what they don't yet know is whether they will have to have a conference recess, a mini recess from Parliament to allow them all to go to that conference. If they don't have that, then next Wednesday, the Prime Minister will have a bit of a diary clash. He's due to be on his feet, giving his first big speech to his conference as Prime Minister at about midday. At the same time, he will be expected to answer Prime Minister's questions in London. Right now, he's meeting the Iranian president for what could be a pretty frosty meeting here. Then he's giving his big speech to the General Assembly. And after that, hot-footing it here from the UN to the airport to try and get back to London. I would be amazed if we don't see him on his feet tomorrow at some point in the House of Commons.
Extraordinary few hours ahead. Carl, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, today's Supreme Court decision is the first to rule the advice of a Prime Minister to a monarch unlawful. Its chair, Lady Hale, whom we saw a few moments ago, said the circumstances have never arisen before and are unlikely to arise again. She called it a one-off. But by overruling the advice of Mr Johnson, the Supreme Court may well have set a precedent and has definitely been a reminder that no one is above the law.
The Prime Minister and the government, Parliament and MPs, and then the Queen. Our unwritten constitution is a careful balance of power and control. The monarch's position is ceremonial, but today's decision made it uncomfortable too. Over her 67-year reign, in private, the Queen has tested the arguments of successive Prime Ministers. Boris Johnson is her 14th PM, but he's the first to have given her advice ruled unlawful.
This decision sets a precedent for the monarch. The monarch now does not have to follow what the Prime Minister advises if the monarch thinks that advice is illegal or incorrect or not reflective overall of what Parliament should be there doing.
There were worries the decision made in this building would see the judges dictate to Parliament, contrary to the rules that run the UK. But the court said today they acted to protect Parliament's primacy, not put pressure on it.
I think what they've done is reinforce the power of Parliament. I don't think it's a power grab by judges. All the judges are doing is saying Parliament is the correct place to be making decisions. It is the sovereign body in our constitution, so bring it back and let it take the decisions. They're not trying to usurp Parliament's role, they're just stopping the executive, preventing Parliament doing its job.
This is where some of the UK's most important historical documents are cared for. 500 years of lawmaking, 6 miles of shelving, and perhaps most importantly, the 1689 Bill of Rights, the closest thing we have to a written constitution. Today, the Supreme Court's job was to uphold the spirit of this place, but they have created a new precedent.
The Supreme Court today has ruled that there are limits to the prerogative power to prorogue Parliament, and that when the government seeks to prorogue Parliament for more than the few days that are necessary to bring one session to an end and start a new session, it needs to have a reasonable justification for doing so. And in particular, it's unlawful for the government to prorogue Parliament in such a way that prevents Parliament from scrutinising the government's actions or from legislating without a proper excuse, a proper justification for doing so.
The Queen learnt her constitution from historian Walter Bagehot, who described the UK as a republic hidden in the folds of monarchy. This evening, that's still true. It's just future monarchs may have even more questions to ask of their prime ministers. Allegra Stratton, News at 10.
So, as you can see, Robert joins us now in the pouring rain. It's been a long day, hasn't it? Some extraordinary pictures on social media of MPs piling back in to London for what
from all over the world,
all over the place. I mean, it's going to be an extraordinary moment, isn't it, tomorrow? Take us through what we can anticipate tomorrow.
Well, you held up this remarkably bare bones order paper which says urgent questions, if any. I'm expecting a whole series of urgent questions to be put down by MPs, which the Speaker will allow, and they will all be designed to embarrass the Prime Minister. There will be questions about why his Attorney General thought that proroguing Parliament, suspending Parliament was lawful, given that the verdict of those 11 Supreme Court judges was so categoric that it wasn't. He will have to explain what he is now going to do over the next few weeks. There will have to be a prorogation at some point to allow for a Queen's speech. My own understanding is it will be a day or so now before that Queen's speech. So we're going to get Parliament running all the way through. He's going to be asked to talk about those famous talks with the EU, which the EU say aren't really happening, and he claims are happening. And then there'll be attempts to force him to disclose more information about no-deal planning, since MPs do not believe that the Yellowhammer document that is all about no-deal planning is the whole story. He will be put on the spot. And then there's one other thing which is absolutely central to what he wants to do. He wants to get his message out to the country. He wants a Tory conference on Monday or Tuesday of next week, so he will try and get a brief holiday, a brief recess. MPs tell me they will not give that to him because they feel they've been abused by him and they don't see why they should do him any favours. And those who will be voting against him include Tory rebels. So he will struggle to get his Tory conference on Monday and Tuesday of next week.
Meanwhile, the whole of the country looks on and wonders what this means for Brexit. Is there an election? Where does this actually leave us and where does it move us to?
So, for me, the other really important element of the Supreme Court judgment, quite apart from the fact that it said repeatedly that he had breached the rules, been engaged in unlawful acts, is it made clear, the judgment, that the Supreme Court is on the side of MPs. And there were even references to this law that was passed against the Prime Minister's wishes to force him to delay Brexit on October the 31st. And what I read into that was that if he tries to get out of what that law tells him to do, which is to go cap in hand to the EU to ask for a delay, the judges will again rule that behaviour unlawful. So he is now captive to MPs. We've never seen anything like this, actually, certainly not in modern times. A Prime Minister so weak but unable to call a general election.
OK, Robert, we'll talk to you again later. Thank you very much indeed for the moment for that.